Joyce has asked me to talk a little bit about the ideas behind my work and about how they develop into installation and sculptural pieces. The piece that you see behind me is a work that's currently in progress. It was shown at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in an interim stage with 2 skeletons and 2 panels of embroidery, but I'm currently working on expanding this piece to become 13 panels and 13 skeletons, and this is a work that I'm expecting will take me probably 2 to 3 years to complete. And the piece is based on Redwork embroidery, which is a historical form of embroidery that was traditionally used for quilts, and I'm going to pull one up now just to show you what those quilts look like. They were quilts that are made, oops, that's upside down, of white fabric with red embroidery, and the embroidery is of animals and birds and nursery rhymes, and sometimes it's patriotic imagery like flags or the Liberty Bell, 4th of July imagery. I'm very interested in history and the idea of how history is recorded and how it shows up in our day-to-day lives. So in this case, I became really interested in the kind of vernacular imagery that appeared on these Redwork quilts, particularly the imagery that referred to historical events or patriotic imagery. When I began this work, a number of images had recently been released from the Abu Ghraib prison, which showed American soldiers torturing prisoners. And I was interested in how these historical quilts leave out large parts of history, and how some of the images on them read differently 100 years after the quilts were made. So for example, in the original quilts, there are many images that we can now see as being related to the history of colonization, so images of indigenous peoples of North America and images of Chinese immigrants who are shown in what today we see as very racist ways. So I began taking Redwork imagery and recombining it with images that I've embroidered of contemporary historical events. And this is an example of one of those embroideries. It's an image that I've created from news photographs of the 9/11 disaster, and this shows the plane hitting the Twin Towers. One of the reasons that I'm interested in recombining this imagery is to challenge the images that are on the historical quilts, but also to make us think about broader themes about how historical events unroll, about how they're remembered, and about the atrocities that have happened throughout history. So the expanded version of the work is going to incorporate a lot of images from the news in the past 50 years, from World War I, World War II, Hiroshima, or the Rwandan genocide, the Abu Ghraib prison, and so on. Once one begins listing these historical atrocities, one starts to lose count, and I think part of the goal of the quilt and its structure is to convey how overwhelming the images become when you see them massed up together. In addition to the quilted background, the dancing skeletons also refer to historical images. They refer to the history of the danse macabre, which date, I think the earliest ones are probably from the 1200s. They re-emerge in the 1500s, the 1800s, and they're often associated with times when the European community was under stress. Large numbers of people were dying in relation to the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. The other reference in using the skeleton was thinking about an opera called The Emperor of Atlantis, which was written by two prisoners who were in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, which was the sort of model camp that the Nazis used to show to officials, for example, the Red Cross. One of the reasons that I'm interested in recombining this imagery is to challenge the images that are on the historical quilts, but also to make us think about broader themes about how historical events unroll, about how they're remembered, and about the atrocities that have happened throughout history. So the expanded version of the work is going to incorporate a lot of images from the news in the past 50 years, from World War I, World War II, Hiroshima, or the Rwandan genocide, the Abu Ghraib prison, and so on. Once one begins listing these historical atrocities, one starts to lose count. And I think part of the goal of the quilt and its structure is to convey how overwhelming the images become when you see them massed up together. In addition to the quilted background, the dancing skeletons also refer to historical images. They refer to the history of the danse macabre, which date, I think the earliest ones are probably from the 1200s. They re-emerge in the 1500s, the 1800s, and they're often associated with times when the European community was under stress. Large numbers of people were dying in relation to the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. The other reference in using the skeleton was thinking about an opera called The Emperor of Atlantis, which was written by two prisoners who were in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, which was the sort of model camp that the Nazis used to show to officials, for example, the Red Cross. And it was where the title for the new piece is Redwork, which is the type of embroidery I'm doing. Redwork, The Emperor of Atlantis. And I like the title, the phrase Redwork, because on one hand it refers to the type of embroidery, but red being the color of blood, and maybe red work could also be read as something related to war and to the kind of atrocities that I'm referencing in the imagery. The Emperor of Atlantis was an opera that was written by Victor Ullmann when he was a prisoner in the Nazi concentration camp at Theresienstadt. And the story of the opera, the story in the libretto, is that Death looks at what man has wrought and says, well, man is doing my job for me. I'm not going to act as Death anymore. And all of a sudden, people can no longer die. And of course, this causes enormous problems. So at the beginning of the opera, for example, guards are trying to kill a prisoner, and the prisoner can't be hung and can't be shot, and so on. And as I'm thinking about history, I feel very overwhelmed by the ongoing history of wars and tragedies and man's cruelty to other men. So thinking about the Emperor of Atlantis and conflating that with the image of the Danse Macabre and the dancing skeletons seemed like a way to pull together all the narratives of the histories and the news stories that I'm referencing in the quilt that you see behind me. When this work is done, it will be a large-scale installation piece. I'm also working on some tangential pieces that will accompany it, and one of those pieces is another Redwork quilt that I have started to reconfigure. So the original quilt has images of flowers and animals like owls and foxes. And it's a quilt that's actually dated. It has an embroidered date on it that reads 1898, which you can see right here. When I complete the quilt, I'll add another date to it, which will be the year that I've completed it. But this quilt is, I'm thinking the title will be A Quilt for Abu Ghraib. So all of the images in here that I've added are embroidered on the surface of the quilt, and they show images that were taken by guards at Abu Ghraib that show them torturing prisoners. So for example, here's the famous image from the news of the hooded prisoner who's being forced to stand on a box in a stressed position, holding out his arms. And the guards have attached wires to his arm, and they've told him that if he falls, he'll be electrocuted. Some of the other images show a prisoner who's being shackled, again in a stressed position, naked, and there's liquid on the floor, which we assume is probably that he's being, that the guards have thrown cold water on him, as cold and heat were often used as a way of stressing prisoners and forcing them to make confessions. Here we see the naked prisoners who are being humiliated by being forced to pile on top of each other naked, and we see the guards behind them giving the thumbs up signal. And up here we see one of the guards who is holding one of the prisoners on a leash and also giving the thumbs up signal. So this entire quilt will have probably 75 to 100 images like this that are embroidered into the surface, so that the visual surface that you see here will be very dense, as opposed to the original quilt, which has a lot of white space left on it. You were asking about why I made these works, whether they are an independent project or something that was done for a specific reason. And I think that's a really good question. These works were works that I made in response to a request to participate in an exhibition. I was invited to be part of an exhibition called Puppet Act, Manipulating the Voice, which was at Robert McLaughlin Gallery, and it was curated by Linda Jansma. And as you can see, it's a group show with a number of artists. Linda asked me if I had any works that responded to the idea of puppetry, and it was a happy coincidence because I was thinking about this piece with the dancing skeletons, and so I was able to create the work with a specific exhibition in mind. And I had about 6 months to finish the piece. Now, as I said, it was shown in this state as what I would consider a work in progress, because I still do want it to become a much bigger piece with 13 skeletons and 13 of these fabric panels. So you were asking about how I get the images onto the fabric, and I actually, before I tell you about that, I'm just going to tell you about the fabric itself. Because the quilts are antique and I want the fabric to blend in with the original quilt fabric, I actually buy a lot of antique fabrics. So this is one where you can see the tag is still on it. To do the transfers, I draw an image with a special kind of pen that's actually designed so that it will transfer onto the fabric using heat. So the way that I do that is to position it where I want it, pin it in place, and then I use a hot iron and I press it probably for about 30 seconds. And the heat helps to transfer the ink onto the fabric and it becomes permanent. So it's actually like the fabric squares that people would have bought when they were making the original quilts. Many of the patterns were published in newspapers and women's magazines, and they were called penny squares because they were sold very, very cheaply. Now, of course, I'm making my own using images from the internet and from the news. So see if that's long enough. And, oops, it needs just a second longer here at the bottom. I didn't press quite hard enough, but it looks like the transfer has happened. So now when I unpin that, you'll see that the image has transferred onto the fabric. And once the fabric is transferred, then I embroider it over it using a needle and thread. And you were asking about how I learned this skill. And I would have to say I learned to embroider when I was very, very young, probably 8 years old. Obviously, it's not something that I did a lot. You know, you learn it as a child and then you don't do it for many years. But for almost every work of art that I create, I learn a new skill. And in this case, because I was responding to quilts that had been embroidered, I began using the same embroidery skills myself so that my work would become camouflaged into the historical quilts.